Hi, everyone. Welcome to Citizen Digital, an ITIF web series where I speak with experts in the United States and around the world to explore how digital technology can improve citizen and customer experience. I'm Eric Egan, the Policy Fellow for Digital Government at ITIF, and with me today is Corinna Turbes, Policy Director at Data Foundation, a nonprofit think tank focused on improving government and society through data-based public policymaking. Corinna, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So, we could start with you just kind of sharing a little bit about yourself and how you came to work in this space.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm the policy director for the Data Foundation, and I've been in this role for about 3 years. And in that space, I've done a lot of work working with private sector, academia, public sector on how to appropriately share data, how to leverage data in the federal space. But prior to that, I was working for an organization that focus primarily on the federal statistical agencies. So this is the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the National Center for Health Statistics, those types of agencies. And before that, I was working in federal advocacy at a nonprofit organization, helping folks get involved in federal policy. And that really included a lot of organizing around the 2020 census. So a lot of data experience from all angles.
Yeah, I was going to say you're a certified data wonk, it seems. So in our first question, this is a series about kind of citizen and customer experience with digital government. One of the questions we always ask is, what's your definition of that, citizen or customer experience with government kind of broadly, and then the role you believe digital technology, and in this case, data plays in that overall experience.
Yeah, so I think I was sort of looking through all our reports to see if we had a written definition, and we really don't. But really, the consumer experience, customer experience is what people go through when they interact with the government. So how they pay their taxes, how they respond to the census, apply for student loans, change their address at Social Security Administration, all those kinds of things. Every touch point for federal services is an opportunity for a consumer or customer experience. And so there's a lot of analogies in this space, obviously, to the private sector, that sort of creating these seamless interactions, these sort of capitalizing on efficiency and effectiveness, including clarity, timeliness, transparency, satisfaction is a big part of this. And while there's sort of lessons to be drawn from the private sector, the government has different motivations, right? It's not as though the government is trying to turn our citizens into profit centers or things like that. They have an obligation to provide services even when it might cost money. But that doesn't mean we can't take a look at some of the innovations that are happening in the private sector how to improve customer experience through digital technologies and digital experiences.
Yeah, I'm glad you hit on that. It's one of the things that people tend to forget when they think about customer experiences with government is, one, you're often thinking about an agency that has a particular budget and isn't generating revenue in order to necessarily improve a lot of their services like a private company can. And there's not competition for the IRS, right? So it's
Right.
Whereas private companies can kind of take a look at what their competitors are doing, and there's kind of various arms races, so to speak, for customer experience. Government not so much. So it really is a different perspective. So yeah, and I think a lot of what we'll end up talking about today is generally the way that data kind of feeds into this in customer experience. But first, I wanted to get to the federal data strategy. So as you know, last month ITIF released a report on the federal data strategy. But before we kind of talk about that a little bit, what is the FDS and why is it such an important federal effort?
Yeah, this was a really great effort that we saw come out of the last administration, but its goal is to fully leverage our federal data assets to help service delivery, to help agencies capitalize on their mission, and to create a public good through our federal data. It's a 10-year plan started in 2020, and it outlined principles and practices as well as discrete action steps to make sure that we were getting the most out of the federal data that we already have, and that we can use it to the best of its ability instead of it just being collected and sitting there for no reason. It's a way of really helping deliver on service and mission for the federal government.
Yeah, and it was one too that ITIF, you know, a few years ago, I guess close to 4 years ago now, when it was the plan was kind of shared by the Trump administration in 2019. We were similarly excited, but our latest report, you know, it found that OMB guidance for this, the Office of Management and Budget, always forgetting to spell out my acronyms. OMB's guidance for the FDS, you know, the action plans. There has been one since 2021. Other guidance for legislation like the Evidence Act has effectively stopped. Any insights on why that may be? Is it because this was a Trump administration thing, and it's, you know, the Biden administration maybe hasn't made it as much of a priority? You know, what may be going on?
So I think this is actually a priority of the Biden administration. In January 2021, he issued a supportive statement, a memo outlining the sort of administration's emphasis on using data, transparency, and trustworthiness. And even though we aren't seeing necessarily new guidance or new action plans, the work hasn't stopped. The federal data strategy is still in effect. It's being implemented through an Office of Management or an OMB memo, essentially, that is still in effect. And so there is still movement happening. We might not be seeing the same, like the refresh that we might have wanted for, but agencies are continuing to do a lot of work that is outlined in the FDS as well as the Evidence Act. One great example is America's Data Hub at the National Science Foundation that's looking to have, you know, data linkages and data sharing to build evidence. So there's a lot of work still happening. I also think it's really important to note that a lot of these issues are hard. You know, it's not as simple as flipping a switch when we're talking about data, and there's a lot riding on getting this guidance right. And so, you know, it's extremely important that it gets done correctly, you know, especially the first time, and that knowing that agencies are still working towards this, and that a lot of these memos and guidances are still in effect, and that it has crossed administrations, which I think is a really important thing to note, that a lot of times we see these management issues toggle, but there's a lot of bipartisanship in this issue, and I think we see that kind of across the administration.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too, and I guess for me it was one of the odder moments about this. You know, the 2021 action plan was released by the Biden administration, so there seemed to be this kind of pickup and like, hey, let's move forward with this. You know, the original, I think when you look at like the principles and practices of the FDS, they're pretty solid. You know, any mature data organization is going to look at this and be like, you know, this makes sense. But I'm curious. So, kind of, you're hitting on, you know, one of my other questions, which is, you know, from your point of view, the FDS, it's still kind of moving. We're maybe not seeing the action plans released. We're not seeing like the progress trackers, some of those things that provide some transparency what the agencies may be doing. And, you know, I spoke with a few, you know, chief data officers at the agency level as well. And, you know, they were doing a lot of things. I think that, to your point, align with the strategy itself, even if they weren't getting the kind of year-over-year guidance. I know the Data Foundation has a lot of intimate relationships with CDOs at the agency level. Any other examples? You know, what else are they doing that maybe does kind of move the FDS forward, but also could just be like their own enterprise level kind of data strategies?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is like really important to look at with the chief data officers in particular is the Chief Data Officers Council, the sort of interagency group that provides a lot of opportunity for knowledge sharing, lessons learned. You know, agencies that are at different stages in their data maturity being able to learn from each other on these aspects. And they've really done quite a bit of work. They have published a data ethics framework, which I think is really important. And really important that was something that was done collaboratively, right? You know, you can't really just have one person, you know, giving your ethics down from on high. Having a sort of collaborative stakeholder engagement process to thinking about your ethics when it comes to using data is a really important thing. So that, I think, is something that was really great that came out of an interagency process. They've also been doing a lot of work thinking about cataloging data skills, developing data literacy within agencies. So that's a better way of making sure that as data is becoming more and more integrated to the culture of agencies, there are people who are there to appropriately leverage that data, understand what it means, ask the right questions. There's also integrating with the learning agendas, which was a requirement of the Evidence Act. So as agencies are identifying their policy priorities, what are the sort of questions we want to have answered, the chief data officers are there to think about what data is present that they can use to answer those questions, what they might want to gather. And so being very strategic about how that data is being leveraged within agency plans. So they're really working hard where they can, finding really great opportunities to collaborate and finding those sort of like strategic ways of making themselves valuable, of creating that culture, developing leadership and those data skills. And I think that's a really important part of the federal data strategy, even if it's not necessarily a discrete check mark on an action plan, that this is a sustained, prolonged change that is happening across a very large enterprise that is our federal government.
It's fair. And I mean, one of the other things I heard too from the agencies, CDOs, was that it's not necessarily a bad thing that they're not getting kind of check the box action plan kind of things, so it's, to me, it's kind of a balancing act between meaningful guidance that aligns with government-wide priorities and CDOs having kind of the autonomy and not red tape, not compliance kind of stuff, where they can move forward with their own mission level priorities, but at the same time kind of aligned with a government-wide strategy. So, one question I guess I have. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say that balancing act, I think, is a really important thing to realize, and is a hard thing that requires a lot of creativity and not
just for the FDS, for any
for any sort of government-wide initiative, having that coordination function is really important, but knowing that these are not one-size-fits-all solutions.
To bring it back a little bit to like the theme of this show, the Biden administration has a lot of priorities around customer experience, the executive order a few years ago. What are the ways thinking of, I guess, in a high level, not even necessarily the data strategy, but why is data so important for some of those, if we're talking about priority life events, we're talking about sweepingly improving customer experience across federal government. Why is data so important for those kinds of initiatives? And I guess that kind of ties into the FDS as well, but more of a high level view.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it comes down to data is sort of the backbone of informed policymaking. So knowing where the pain points are in customer service, how long is the average wait time to talk to a person at the IRS? How long are folks waiting to get their benefits from the VA? Knowing sort of where those pain points are and being able to have a good evaluation and craft a policy in response to solve that problem is reliant on having that good data. And so it gives us insights and allows us to design solutions and then evaluate those solutions to see if they've actually solved the problem. And so it really is the sort of water we are all swimming in. We couldn't do anything to solve customer experience problems. We couldn't do anything to design solutions without that data. And I think even forward looking, we talk about as solving a problem, data is what is going to feed into equitable, fair AI systems. So, if you needed to log into, I pick on the IRS a lot, but they've been doing a really good job on their customer service improvement plans. I have a question on a tax return from 2001 in this state, using a machine that can put me to the right person, instead of having to integrate into that. That is also something that is going to rely on good data. And so thinking about what data we already have, how we can collect it in a non-burdensome way is a really important part of improving digital services and the customer service component that goes along with it.
Yeah, it's a great point. Not to mention increasing use of artificial intelligence in government. It's really kind of useless unless you have solid data governance really across the board. Particularly if you think about, one of the other priorities in the Biden administration was the priority life events that you're talking about. interoperability there, agencies needing to work together to kind of deliver on a life event moment, which is often interagency in nature, right? If you have someone who's in a disaster moment and they need support from FEMA or Health and Human Services and things like that. So, a lot of that kind of enhanced interoperability also relies on data standards, data sharing, so many of those other things there. So I don't know if that's a question as much of a comment.
That ability to predict is also something that really relies on data and can really contribute to excellent customer service. Using your FEMA example, knowing that even a year after a disaster comes through, we're going to have to put more education supports in as students' school is disrupted, as hospital services are disrupted. Using the data to sort of predict where to allocate resources in the future to support customer interaction is another reason why having data be accessible and available for evaluation is so important, because it allows us to see problems on the horizon and not just fully respond to problems as they are happening.
So I do want to get to a report that the Data Foundation released last month as well. So this one is maybe a little more positive than my own, but it focused on kind of customer government experience success stories. And I was wondering if you'd maybe be willing to highlight a few of those, particularly if there's any role that data played in improving that customer experience in these examples.
Yeah, I think the ones that, well, first of all, I'll recommend that people go and read the full report. There's a lot of really good details in there. But, I've been talking about the IRS a lot, but they improved the accessibility of representatives on the phone to be able to reduce wait times, and implemented the sort of taxpayer experience office with this sort of mission to create experience for taxpayers, and that relied on a lot of evaluation data in order to do that. FEMA, again, that's something that we've touched on briefly, enhanced applicant services. So to provide additional interactions for disaster survivors to improve this sort of application process and getting disaster assistance. And that requires interoperable data, understanding who your clients' customers are, what challenges they are going through, sort of the transportation that falls apart around folks in these issues, the medical services that fall apart around in these services. And so being able to centralize some of those application services to expedite them makes it a really great use of data to improve customer service.
Cool. Any other, because I knew the report that did just highlight examples, it also had a set of kind of recommendations as well. Any of those that maybe apply across the board, or kind of best practices or thoughts that really apply to any federal agency?
Yeah, so there are 5 recommendations, but 3 of them really come down to consulting cross-disciplinary experts, including the evaluation officers, your chief data officers, and your statistical officials. And, there's sort of no coincidence that those are the 3 officials sort of created and outlined in the Evidence Act, because, those 3 lanes sort of help triangulate a good data infrastructure that can help you build the data system that you need to make these evaluations. So making sure that you are aligning with evaluation officers to ensure that customer experience activities are a part of evaluation plans, that they're a part of your learning agendas and can design data collections to meet those evaluation questions. The CDOs that can make sure that those data collections are supported, are protected, are, within the agency's capabilities. And then your statistical officials who can help design the surveys and the data collection. And all of those people play an important role in making sure that the data that you have is serving the need to service customer experience. This also is a really good time to bring up sort of understanding the diversity of the American public in this. Agencies that are collecting new data from the public to support consumer experience interaction, that's a diverse population. That is a huge swath of people who have different languages, different backgrounds, different, the ability to recruit them into a survey, those who are not able to access digital services. All of that needs to be considered when you are thinking about your customer service. You know, it's one thing to reduce call times, but also the reality is a lot of folks don't necessarily have access to a phone or the internet. So how are you going to serve them as well? And that's like a really hard thing to have to think about, but it's something that's worth doing. And then the final recommendation is that that these tools and capabilities should be ready to support the adoption of artificial intelligence. You know, it's the buzzword for a reason, and that these will be very powerful tools, and having our data be ready for that, be ready to able to serve and capitalize on those will be a really important part.
Yeah, that the solid set of recommendations and very good points. It's one we make at ITIF a lot, particularly in my area when we focus on digital government. But I think that's why we ended up focusing on the FDS, the data strategy, because, you know, on the one hand, it's great to see that agency CDOs are continuing to drive forward. The ones that I spoke to, you know, they talked about how the culture was saying how great the federal CDO council was. The culture of like data being this other was beginning to change. So I think they still want a better seat at the table, but they were speaking in terms of, you know, my outcomes, my offices, the CDO offices outcomes are program outcomes, right? You know, data is not some other thing. It's a part of what drives how a government delivers, or an agency delivers, you know, their business processes and whatnot. I know we're running short on time, but at least one final question, maybe again, having this as a data in a data spin perhaps, and you're already hitting on maybe AI, but in terms of, you know, what excites you about digital experiences in government service delivery moving forward, you know, anything worth highlighting or that you think is particularly interesting or exciting?
Yeah, I think when we are talking about the future of digital services, customer experience, and the data aspects that can support that, a conversation that's starting to happen more and more is the conversation around a digital identifier. You know, there's a lot of conversations around a data system that is interoperable, that is secure, that protects privacy and confidentiality. And, you know, concepts around a digital identifier, you know, a way of identifying citizens across agencies, right, is something that we're really starting to talk about in earnest. Many other countries have something like this, but I think the policy conversations around is that something that would work here? If so, how? Is that something that we want? How do we navigate a federal identifier with a state identifier? You know, that's also a question that, you know, a lot of European countries that have adopted this don't necessarily have to navigate. And so these questions around digital identity and how they can be useful, what are some of the pitfalls, and how do we design a good system that would employ that technology, if that's something we want, is a really sort of exciting thing that's happening, and really looking forward to seeing what are the topics that come up there. I think it's kind of the next big question that we're going to have to grapple with in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, you and me both. I'm curious to see how this evolves, especially because it's, as you say, it's a very unique situation in the United States compared to, you know, other kind of Western countries. So it's not a lot of the European countries who have implemented kind of national IDs or digital IDs aren't as federated, don't have those kind of challenges, and don't have the legacy structures and systems that we have. But it is also a very exciting, particularly as, you know, everyone kind of agrees there's so much room to improve in terms of how we're able to identify and authenticate someone, especially as digital transformation in agencies at all levels continues to advance. So no, I agree. It's one topic I keep kind of a top of mind.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see what are the ways, you know, and maybe we wouldn't need a singular identifier if we had better interoperability between state systems. Say my Washington, D.C. driver's license, how does that interact with the federal level? And, you know, can we, you know, use all of these privacy enhancing technologies and new computational powers to figure out a way to do it that gets us around this sort of national registry that has a lot of baggage associated with it. So there's really cool
non-starter.
There's a lot of like really cool policy solutions to some of the challenges that we have. And I am really excited to see folks starting to talk about them, and really excited to hear people a lot smarter than me figuring out this challenge and having to run with it once they do. So.
That's my point of view too. I just, wait for the smart people. And well, that's about all the time we have for this episode. I want to thank Corinna again for joining us. For our audience, don't forget to subscribe to ITIF on YouTube for other great videos in technology policy, and stay tuned for more episodes of Citizen Digital.